Graham Dalton dropped to one knee in the frozen mud at the edge of the pine ridge, and his breath stopped in his chest like a stone thrown into still water. The boot print was small, too small to belong to any trapper he knew, too deliberate in its placement to belong to anyone stumbling lost through the high country. It was pressed deep into the soft earth between two exposed roots of a Douglas fir, the heel clear and sharp. The toe pointed northeast toward the steepest part of his trail, the part that no stranger should have known about, the part he had never shown to another living soul. He had built this life on secrecy, on silence, on the understanding that no one came up the mountain unless he invited them, and he had not invited anyone in 3 years. 3 years of timber and cold mornings, and the kind of quiet that either heals a man or finishes the job that grief started. He was never entirely certain which it had been doing to him, but this print was not from today. He pressed 2 fingers into the earth at the edge of the impression and measured the moisture, the compression, the way the surrounding mud had dried and cracked in a ring around the deeper center. 2 days. This print was 2 days old, and whoever had made it had been moving with purpose up his mountain, along his trail, toward his home. He stood. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line the way a man does when he is trying to appear calm while every nerve in his body is screaming. Then he looked down at the ground again, reading it the way he had spent 15 years learning to read it, and that was when he saw the second set. These were different. The same small boot, the same careful stride, but dragging now, the left heel leaving a long scrape, the right pressing harder than it should, the whole pattern telling a story that made his jaw tighten. Someone was hurt. Someone had come up this mountain 2 days ago on steady feet and was now coming back down on broken ones, and the trail of those second prints disappeared into the dense spruce thicket 60 yards to his east, where the ground dropped off into a shallow ravine. Graham Dalton had spent 3 years building a life designed to keep him from caring about other people's trouble. He followed the second set. The story of how he came to stand at the edge of that ravine, and why what he found there changed everything he believed about himself, and about the kind of man he still wanted to be, began 4 days earlier and 50 miles south, in the last decent town before the mountains swallowed the world. The town of Harlow, Colorado, in the autumn of 1878, was not a beautiful place. It sat at the base of the San Juan Range like something the mountains had coughed up and forgotten about, a scatter of raw plank buildings and rutted streets that turned to thick red mud every time the sky opened up, which in October was often. The railroad had come close but not close enough, and Harlow survived on timber contracts, a single working mine 3 miles east, and the kind of stubbornness that the high country bred into people whether they wanted it or not. Maria Whitaker arrived on the afternoon stage from Pueblo with 1 leather trunk, a doctor's bag that was not hers by birth but was hers by the hardest kind of education, and a letter in her coat pocket that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The letter was from her brother Thomas, who had written 3 months ago to say he had finally made something of himself in Harlow, that he had a claim worth working and a stake worth protecting, and that she should come west before winter closed the passes. She had come west. But when she stepped off the stage and looked for Thomas's face in the small crowd of onlookers, she found instead the face of a man she did not know, the town sheriff, a flat-eyed man named Burl Cassidy, who told her, with the particular absence of gentleness that frontier lawmen sometimes mistook for professionalism, that her brother was dead, had been dead for 6 weeks. Mining accident, the sheriff said. Unfortunate, common enough up here. Maria had stood very still in the middle of the street with the red mud drying on her boots and the cold wind cutting through her traveling coat, and she had felt the bottom of everything fall out from beneath her. She had no money beyond what she had spent to get here. She had no connection in this town, no employer, no plan that did not begin with Thomas being alive. And she had a doctor's bag full of instruments and knowledge that this town desperately needed, because the closest actual physician was in Durango, which was a 4-hour ride in good weather. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Edna Pierce, who charged her $2 a week and told her in the same breath that the mine foreman had been asking around for someone who could treat injuries, because they lost a worker to infection every other month and it was beginning to affect morale. Maria took the work. She had no choice, but she did not stop thinking about what the sheriff had said, and more specifically, about what he had not said. She had spent 5 years working alongside Dr. Franklin Oakes in Kansas City, and in that time she had seen more mining injuries than most people cared to imagine. She knew what they looked like. She knew what they produced in terms of paperwork, in terms of witness accounts, in terms of the particular shape that grief took in a community that had watched one of its own go into the dark. There was none of that in Harlow. There was no grave marker she could find for Thomas. There was no mention of him in the single-room land office when she went to ask about his claim. There was only the sheriff's flat eyes and the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that someone in this town was lying to her. 2 weeks after her arrival, she found Thomas's journal in the bottom of a trunk she had paid 50 cents to retrieve from the room he had been renting at the same boarding house. The trunk had been pushed into a back closet and forgotten, or perhaps left deliberately, and inside it, beneath his good Sunday shirt and his extra pair of boots, was the journal. She read it in a single night by the light of a tallow candle, and by morning she knew 2 things with certainty. Her brother had not died in a mining accident, and the man who had arranged his death owned the largest mine in Harlow. His name was Wendell Price. He was 47 years old, and he had been quietly acquiring mining claims in the San Juan foothills for the better part of a decade by the time Thomas arrived with a legitimate claim that happened to sit directly atop a secondary ore vein that Price had been trying to access for 2 years. According to Thomas's journal, Price had offered to buy him out 3 times. Thomas had refused 3 times. And 6 weeks before Maria arrived, Thomas had written his last entry. He had found evidence that Price's men had been salting competing claims to drive down their value, and he was going to take what he had to the Territorial Land Office in Denver. He had never made it to Denver. Maria sat in her small room at Edna Pierce's boarding house with the journal in her lap, and understood with icy clarity that she was in serious danger. If Price had been willing to kill her brother over a claim dispute, he would not hesitate to silence a grieving sister who had just arrived in town asking questions. She needed to get to Denver. She needed to get to the territorial authorities with the journal and the documentation Thomas had assembled, and she needed to do it before Price realized who she was and what she had found. She had spent 2 days planning her route. The main road south was too exposed, Price had men on it, and the stage office was owned by his business partner. The road east to the railroad was longer and passed directly through Price's mine property. But there was a third option, one that the old-timers at the boarding house dinner table had discussed with the casual familiarity of people who had lived in the shadow of the San Juans their whole lives. The old trapper's trail that went north through the high country, cutting across the mountain, and coming down on the eastern side near a small settlement called Ridgefield, which had a telegraph office. From Ridgefield, she could wire the territorial marshal's office directly. The trail, they said, was steep and cold, and not recommended for anyone who was not already comfortable in the high country. It was also, they said, the private domain of a mountain man who had been living up there alone for 3 years and who was known to be unfriendly to visitors. They called him Dalton. Maria Whitaker had grown up in Ohio. She had spent 5 years in Kansas City. She had never climbed a mountain in her life, and the idea of doing so in October, when the first serious snows were already closing the upper passes, was the most frightening thing she had considered in a week full of frightening considerations. But she had also treated enough men who had died of inaction, men who had waited too long to seek help, who had sat with a treatable wound, until it became a fatal one, to know that fear was not a sufficient reason to stay still. She left Harlow before dawn on a borrowed horse with the journal sewn into the lining of her coat and her doctor's bag tied to the saddle, and she started north toward the mountain. The first day went better than she had expected. The lower trail was clear and marked by old blazes on the trees, and the borrowed horse, a sturdy brown mare named Bess, was sure-footed and unimpressed by the altitude. Maria found a rhythm to the climbing, a focus that came from the necessity of watching the trail, reading the ground, keeping the mare calm. She was good at focus. It was one of the things Dr. Oakes had said about her repeatedly, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with exasperation. Maria Whitaker was the most focused person he had ever trained, and she could hold her attention on a difficult thing long past the point where most people looked away. She made camp that first night in a hollow below the tree line, cold but dry, wrapped in 2 blankets with the mare hobbled nearby. She ate hard bread and dried meat and thought about Thomas, about the last time she had seen him, which had been Christmas 3 years ago in their parents' house in Cincinnati before their parents died within 6 months of each other, and the world split apart and sent them both spinning in separate directions. She thought about the journal, about the names Thomas had written down, about the evidence he had gathered, which was specific and documented, and which she had copied in her own hand onto 3 separate sheets of paper now distributed between the journal lining, her boot, and the bottom of the doctor's bag. She was not going to let this disappear. She was not going to let Thomas's death be the end of it. She thought about Graham Dalton. She wondered what kind of man chose to live alone at high altitude for 3 years. She wondered if he was dangerous. She decided she would not find out by approaching his cabin directly. She would stay on the trail and pass through his territory as quickly and quietly as she could, and if she was very careful and very lucky, he would never know she had been there. On the second day, the trail became harder. It narrowed as it climbed, the spruce and fir closing in on either side, the ground rockier and more treacherous, the air noticeably thinner. The mare's breathing became labored on the steepest sections, and Maria dismounted and led her twice to spare her the weight. She was watching the trail so carefully, so focused on the next 20 feet in front of her, that she did not notice the small slide area on her left until the mare shied and the ground gave way. It was not a dramatic fall. That was almost the worst part, how ordinary it was, how quickly and quietly it happened. The mare jumped left. Maria's foot caught in the stirrup for a fraction of a second too long, and she came down hard on her left side on a patch of bare rock, her ankle twisting beneath her as the stirrup released. She lay still for a moment assessing, the way she had trained herself to do, starting from the center and working out. Her ribs ached but were not broken. Her left wrist had taken some impact but could bear weight. Her left ankle, however, was a different matter. It was not broken, she was fairly certain of that, but it was badly sprained, already swelling in her boot, and when she put her weight on it to stand it sent a pain up her leg sharp enough to make her catch her breath. The mare had not run. Maria was grateful for that. She caught the reins and stood holding them, thinking. She was above the tree line now, exposed, the trail continuing up and over a rocky ridge before descending toward Ridgefield. She could see the ridge from here. She could also see the clouds building to the northwest in a way she had learned in 2 weeks of Colorado autumn to recognize as a serious weather sign. She made a decision. There was a dense stand of spruce 200 yards back down the trail, where the ground was sheltered and level enough to make a reasonable camp. She would go back down to it, rest the ankle for the remainder of the day and through the night, wrap it properly with the bandage material in her doctor's bag, and reassess in the morning. If the swelling responded to rest and elevation, she could still cross the ridge tomorrow. If it did not, she would need to think harder. She did not, at that moment, know that she was making camp in the ravine that sat 60 yards east of Graham Dalton's primary trail. She did not know that when she pressed her boot into the soft earth at the trail's edge to test the ground's stability, she was leaving a print he would find 2 days later. She was simply a woman in pain doing the most rational thing available to her, which was to find shelter and give herself time. The night was brutal. The temperature dropped faster than she had anticipated, and despite both blankets and the mare's body warmth, she was shaking by midnight. Her ankle had swollen to fill her boot so completely that she could not remove the boot without cutting it, and she was not willing to do that yet because the boot was providing compression. She had drunk too much water too fast with the altitude and was nauseous, and the wind coming down from the ridge above had a voice like something angry, and she lay in the dark listening to it and thought very carefully about whether she had made a mistake coming up this mountain. She decided she had not. She had made a mistake not planning for the possibility of injury, but the decision to come, to refuse to stay still in Harlow while Wendell Price's men figured out who she was, that had been right. Sometimes the right decision led you into difficult places. That did not make it the wrong decision. Graham Dalton found her on the third day, but he found her boot print on the second. He had been coming down his primary trail from the upper meadow where he had been cutting timber, and he almost walked past it. He would have walked past it if the light had not been at that particular low afternoon angle that turned every depression in the ground into a shadow. But it was, and he saw it, and he stopped. One small boot print, fresh enough to be from that day or the day before, pressed into the earth with the confident weight of someone moving with intention. He stood there for a long time. He was 31 years old, Graham Dalton, and he was not precisely what the people in Harlow imagined when they talked about him. They imagined something wilder, more ragged, more deliberately frightening. The truth was more complicated and in some ways more sad. He was a big man, over 6 feet, broad through the chest and shoulders from 3 years of timber work, with dark hair that had grown past the point of tidiness, and a beard he kept trimmed mostly out of habit. He had gray eyes that had been described at various points in his life as thoughtful and as cold, sometimes by the same person on different days, and a face that had once been considered handsome in a way that had more to do with expression than feature, although he had largely stopped making expressions that anyone would consider warm. He had come up this mountain to grieve. That was the honest version, the one he told himself in the small hours before dawn, when the silence pressed against the cabin walls, and he could not maintain the simpler story of a man who had chosen solitude for practical reasons. He had come up here after his wife, Clara, died in the spring of 1875, died in the way that women sometimes died in the West, in ways that no one talked about plainly, and he had felt something in him go so dark and so still that he had been genuinely uncertain whether he would come back from it. He had built the cabin. He had cut the timber. He had carried water from the creek and split wood and mended fences that did not need mending and done every physical thing he could think of to fill the hours so that the grief did not have enough quiet to finish its work. And slowly, over 3 years, it had resolved into something he could carry rather than something that carried him. He was not happy, but he was functional, and he was honest about the difference. He had not, however, resolved the accompanying conviction that allowing himself to care about another person was the most dangerous thing a man could do. That one he had preserved carefully, tended to it the way he tended to the rest of his solitary life, kept it sharp and useful as a tool. He did not want to care about who had made this boot print. He did not want to think about what it might mean. He most definitely did not want to follow it. He followed it. The print led him to the edge of the primary trail, and then seemed to veer off into the spruce thicket. But the undergrowth was dense enough that he could not track it easily in the failing afternoon light, and he decided to come back in the morning when he could read the ground properly. He went back to his cabin that night and ate his supper and sat by the fire and told himself repeatedly that a single boot print on the edge of his trail was not his concern. People passed through this country. They had been doing it for as long as there had been people in country to be passed through. Whoever had made that print had probably kept moving, was probably halfway to Ridgefield by now, was certainly not his problem. But the print had been small. and it had been pressed in with the particular weight distribution of someone carrying more than they should have been, the heel deeper than the toe in a way that suggested a heavy pack combined with a forward lean. And the direction it had been heading northeast, that direction led toward the ravine, and the ravine was not a destination, it was a dead end, and why would someone with any knowledge of this terrain deliberately walk toward a dead end? He was out of the cabin before full light the next morning. He found the second set of prints before he found the first ravine approach, and the story they told him was worse than he had imagined. The left heel drag, the uneven weight distribution. Someone hurt, moving carefully, trying to manage pain. And the prints did not continue north or south or east. They circled, doubled back, stopped and started, describing the movement of someone who had lost direction or had stopped trying to find it. He followed the second set. The ravine was shallow, maybe 15 feet at its deepest, with a small frozen runnel at the bottom and walls of crumbling shale that caught the early light and held it in pale gray planes. He almost missed her because she had pulled both blankets up over herself, including her head, and the bundle she made against the base of the ravine wall was too regular to be a natural formation, but too still to immediately read as a person. The mare saw him first. The animal's head came up from where it was standing at the edge of the flat ground above, and it gave a low, interested sound, and the bundle against the wall shifted. He said, "I am not going to hurt you." He said it immediately, before she could fully surface from sleep, before she could make a decision based on surprise that might cause either of them a problem. He had known enough frightened people to understand that the first words out of a man's mouth in a situation like this were not for his benefit but for theirs. The blanket moved, and then a face appeared. Brown eyes. Dark hair, significantly disordered by whatever had happened to her in the last several days, but a face that was startlingly alert for someone who had just woken up in a ravine in October. She was looking at him with an assessment so direct and unguarded that it took him a moment to understand she was not afraid, or rather, she was afraid and was choosing not to perform the fear. "I did not intend to be on your trail," Maria Whitaker said. Her voice was steady. "I apologize for the trespass." Graham Dalton stared at her. "How long have you been in this ravine?" "Since yesterday afternoon, my ankle." She pushed the blanket back further and he could see the boot on her left foot, the leather stretched tight over the swelling. "I believe it is a significant sprain. I have kept weight off it, but the compression is not sufficient. I have bandage material, but I cannot apply it properly without removing the boot, and I needed the compression more than the proper dressing at the time." She paused. "I am a medical practitioner. I know what I am looking at." He came down the ravine wall carefully, testing each foot placement, and crouched beside her without sitting, which she registered, the ease with which he moved in difficult terrain, the complete absence of any awkwardness with the elevation or the cold or the particular challenge of a shale-walled ravine. "Can you stand?" "With help, yes. I tried unassisted last evening and it was not advisable." He offered his hand. She looked at it for a half-second with an expression he could not quite read, something between assessment and decision, and then she took it, and he brought her up in a single smooth motion that required him to take most of her weight through the transition, and she made a sound that was very short and very controlled when her left foot took the transfer. "My cabin is 20 minutes north," he said. "I can carry you, or you can ride the mare." "I would recommend the mare because the trail is better suited to it and I need my hands free on the slope." She looked at him again with that same direct assessment. "You are Dalton," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "They said you were unfriendly." "I am not unfriendly," he said. "I am private. There is a difference." Something moved through her expression that might, in another context, have been the beginning of a smile. "There is," she agreed. "I would appreciate the use of the mare." He helped her up to the mare's back and led the animal up out of the ravine by the easiest approach, and they went north along his trail in the early morning quiet, with the first serious snow of the season beginning to come down through the trees in soft, deliberate flakes. He did not ask her any questions while they walked. She offered no explanation. This mutual silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised him, because he had found over the past 3 years that most silences between people contained an anxious current, a sense of pressure to fill the space. This one did not. She rode with her back straight despite the ankle, watching the trail ahead with those attentive brown eyes, and he walked beside the mare and thought about the boot prints and said nothing. His cabin was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. It was larger than the word cabin implied, a serious structure of fitted logs with a real stone fireplace, a split-board roof in good repair, 2 glass windows that must have been carried up this mountain at considerable effort. Inside it was clean in the way that a person's space becomes clean when they have had enough time alone to impose their preferences on it without compromise. Everything had a place, every tool was where it belonged, and there was a quality to the order that was not rigid but was thorough. He helped her down from the mare and through the door, and to the chair nearest the fire, which he built up from the banked coals with the economy of motion she was beginning to notice was characteristic of him. Then he brought a second chair and a folded blanket and set them facing her without instruction. "For the ankle," he said. She elevated it on the second chair, and he stood back with his arms crossed and watched her begin to work on the boot lacing with steady hands. After a moment he said, "Tell me what you need." "Hot water," she said, "and if you have anything that could be used for a cold compress, snow packed in cloth would do perfectly at this point. And I will need to borrow a knife to split the boot seam. I cannot get it off otherwise." He had the water on before she had finished the sentence, and produced a folding knife from his belt that he set on the chair arm beside her with a clean cloth. Then he went out for snow and came back with a packed compress that she recognized, with a small internal note of surprise as being the correct density for the purpose, not too tight, not too loose, wrapped in clean burlap. "You have done this before," she said. "I have turned my own ankle on this mountain twice," he said. "The second time I did it better." She cut the boot seam and eased the boot off in 2 stages and looked at the ankle and confirmed her assessment. A severe sprain, possibly involving the anterior talofibular ligament. No obvious fracture, significant swelling, but the color was reasonable and the circulation was intact. She cleaned it with warm water and wrapped it properly and applied the compress, and during this process neither of them spoke, but she was aware of him, the steady presence of him, standing a few feet back, not hovering but not absent either. When she had finished, he brought her coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had been enduring at Edna Pierce's boarding house, and she wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at him across the rim and said, "I need to get to Ridgefield." "Not today," he said. "I am aware of that." She took a breath. "I need to get to Ridgefield within the next several days. I have information that needs to reach the territorial marshal's office, and there is a man in Harlow who I believe intends to prevent me from delivering it." He was quiet for a long moment. He had sat down in the chair across from her, and she noticed that when he sat the way he moved, fully, without the provisional quality that some people had, as if they were always half ready to leave. He was entirely present in the chair, his hands resting on his knees, his gray eyes on her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about Thomas's death, and the journal and Wendell Price, and the mining claims, and the evidence Thomas had assembled before someone arranged for him to never reach Denver. She told him about the sheriff's flat eyes and the lack of a grave marker, and the 3 copies of the documentation she had distributed through her belongings. She told him about the trail and the mare and the slide and the ankle, laying it all out in the same clear, sequential way she had been trained to report a patient's history, complete and without editorial, letting the facts carry the weight. When she finished, Graham Dalton looked at the fire for a long moment. "Thomas Whitaker," he said. She went very still. "Did you know him?" "He came to see me," Graham said slowly. "About 6 weeks ago. He came up the trail on a Tuesday afternoon. I could hear him coming from a quarter mile out. He was not a quiet traveler, and he knocked on the door and introduced himself and said he had been told I was the only person in this part of the territory he could trust. He paused. I told him I was not in the business of being trusted. He asked for help, Maria said. It was not a question either. She knew her brother. She knew the shape of what Thomas would have done. He asked me to hold something for him, Graham said, in case something happened before he could get to Denver. The fire crackled. The snow was coming down harder outside, visible through the glass window, fat and serious. He left documents with you, Maria said, and her voice was very careful, very even. A sealed envelope, Graham said. Inside was a surveyor's report and a sworn statement from 2 of Price's former workers. He said if he did not come back within 3 weeks to collect it, I should get it to the territorial marshal myself. He stood and went to the back wall of the cabin, to a space between 2 roof timbers that was not obvious unless you knew to look for it, and he reached up and brought down a flat oilskin packet, sealed with wax. He set it on the chair arm beside Maria's hand. He did not come back, Graham said. Maria looked at the packet. She looked at Graham. She had spent 4 weeks carrying grief and fear, and a determination that had felt, in the worst moments, like the only thing keeping her vertical. And now she was sitting in a mountain man's cabin with the snow closing in outside, and the piece of the story she had not known she was missing had been here the whole time, held by a stranger who had spent 3 years on this mountain trying not to care about anyone and had, despite his best efforts, held her dead brother's evidence against the hour when it would matter. She pressed the packet flat with her palm. She said, his name was Thomas Richard Whitaker. He was 28 years old. He liked coffee with too much sugar, and he argued about everything, and he was the best person I have ever known. Graham sat back down. I know, he said quietly. He told me about you. He said you were the one person he had never been able to win an argument against. Maria laughed. It came out sudden and unexpected and slightly rough at the edges, the laugh of a person who has not laughed in longer than they realized. He was wrong about that, she said. He won exactly half of them. He just refused to admit it. Graham did not laugh, but something changed in his face. The quality of his attention shifted in a way she could not fully name but felt clearly, the way you can feel a change in temperature before you can measure it. The snow is going to be serious today, he said. The ridge trail will not be passable until it clears. You will need to stay here until it does. How long? He looked at the window. 2 days, maybe 3, she nodded. Then we have 2 or 3 days to be prepared. I have the documentation from Thomas's journal. You have the packet. Between the 2 of them, she paused. Between the 2 of them, I think we have enough to convict Wendell Price of conspiracy to commit murder and the fraudulent acquisition of at least 6 independent mining claims. I need to organize it properly. I need to write a summary document that will be immediately legible to the marshal's office. Can you get me paper? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested she had done something he had not fully expected. Yes, he said, and then, you are very determined. My brother died, she said simply. Determination is the least I owe him. Graham got her paper. They worked for most of that first day. Graham had been a contract surveyor before he came up the mountain. She learned this in fragments, not offered all at once but emerging in the spaces between tasks, as relevant context rather than personal disclosure, and his familiarity with survey documentation meant he could interpret the materials in Thomas's packet in ways that she had struggled with. Together they assembled a picture that was, if anything, more damning than she had understood when she was working from the journal alone. Price had not only arranged Thomas's death, he had been doing it, or versions of it, for years. For other men had died under circumstances that were officially described as accidents. 2 women had been run off claims they held legally, one of them by means that Thomas's former co-worker had described in the sworn statement in terms that made Maria's hands tighten on the paper. She did not hide this reaction, and did not particularly try to. Graham noticed it and did not comment, but when they stopped for the midday meal, he brought her a bowl of venison stew with a piece of good dense bread, and set it in front of her with a care that she felt as something more than domestic routine. She ate it without saying anything and felt some of the cold that had been living in her chest since she arrived in Harlow begin, very slightly, to ease. In the afternoon she reorganized the documents and Graham went out to tend to the animals and returned with more wood and the information that the snow was, as he had predicted, going to be significant. She asked him about the mountain and he told her about it, the way the seasons moved through it, the wildlife, the timber stands, the way the snow fell differently at different elevations. He talked about it the way a person talks about something they have lived with long enough to understand, and she listened not because she needed the information, but because she liked the sound of his voice in the cabin, which was low and unhurried and never demanded anything from her. She asked him once carefully why he had come up here, and he was quiet for longer than she had learned was his usual pause before speaking. "I lost someone," he said finally. "Your wife," she said. She had put it together from small pieces. The second set of dishes he had not removed from the shelf, the two blankets in the chest that were clearly differentiated by their wear patterns, a woman's garden plot at the east side of the cabin, untended now but marked by the stones that had been laid around it with someone's care. He looked at her. "Yes." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it the way she had learned to mean it, not as a social form but as a genuine acknowledgement that his loss was real and mattered. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "Loss does not have an expiration date," she said. "You know that." He was quiet again. "Then, you are direct." "I am," she agreed. "It has not always been my most popular quality." "I do not find it unpopular," he said. And then, as if surprised by his own honesty, he looked back at the fire. The second day was different from the first. The urgency of the documents was satisfied. They had what they needed organized and ready. And what remained was the weather and the waiting and the particular quality of enforced proximity that a snowstorm in a mountain cabin produces in two people who are, if they are honest with themselves, not entirely indifferent to each other. They talked more. Maria's ankle still would not bear full weight, but she could move carefully through the cabin, and she made herself useful in the ways available to her. She organized his medical supplies, which were basic but better than she had expected. She prepared the evening meal. She sat at the table and wrote in her own journal the things she needed to remember about the past weeks. Graham went about his outdoor work and came back with the cold still on his coat and the air of a man who had been doing something he was good at, which was managing an isolated property in serious weather. And each time he returned she noticed the way the cabin adjusted to his presence, the way the space organized itself differently with two people in it rather than one. On the second evening he sat across from her after supper and said, without preamble, "Why did you become a medical practitioner?" "It is not a common path." She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for him to ask something personal. She considered how to answer and decided to tell him the truth, because he had been honest with her in the ways that he had been capable of, and she thought he deserved the same. "My mother was ill for the last 4 years of her life," she said. "We had a doctor, a good man, but he could only come once a week, and in between his visits I was the one who managed her care. I gave her medicines, I monitored her symptoms, I learned everything I could read about her condition so that I would not miss something that mattered, and I found that I was good at it. Not the managing, I mean the seeing. The ability to look at a person and understand what is happening inside them. Doctor Oakes, when I came to him in Kansas City, said it was the rarest quality in medical work and the most important." She looked at the table. "She died anyway, but she died well. She was not in pain and she knew what was happening and she was not afraid. I could give her that." Graham had been listening without interrupting, his hands still on the table in front of him. "You stayed after she died," he said. "With Oakes, you could have gone elsewhere." "I could have," she agreed. "But the work mattered. And then Thomas wrote and said he needed someone in his corner, and I packed up and came west." She did not say the rest of it, that she had also been, in some sense, running from Kansas City, from the familiar, comfortable shape of a life that had begun to feel like a room with the windows painted shut. She thought he understood it anyway, because he was a man who had done his own version of the same thing. "Thomas was lucky to have you," Graham said. "He did not get to keep me very long," she said. "No," Graham said, "but he knew you were coming. He mentioned it when he was here. He said his sister would make the journey even if the world ended trying to stop her." He paused. He was right. Maria was very quiet for a moment. "He knew I would come." "He was counting on it," Graham said. And then, gently, "He left the packet here because he knew you would eventually make it up this mountain. He knew what you would do when you arrived in Harlow and found him gone. He trusted you to do the right thing with what he had gathered." She understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that this had been Thomas's final act of belief in her. Not just the collection of evidence, but the placement of it here, in the hands of the one man Thomas had trusted, on the mountain that led to the only route she would know to take. Her brother had laid a trail for her with his last weeks of life, a trail she had followed without knowing she was following it, and it had led her here. She pressed her hands flat on the table and let herself feel this for a moment without managing it. Graham did not move or speak, but he was present in the way he had been present since the first moment in the ravine, fully, without qualification, as if her grief were not something that required a response, but simply something that deserved to be witnessed. After a while she said, "Tell me something about this mountain," and he told her. He talked about the elk migration in the fall, and the way the creek froze from the edges inward, and the particular sound the wind made in the high spruce when it came from the northwest, and the way the stars looked in January at this altitude when the air was dry and cold and completely still. He talked for a long time, longer than she suspected he had talked about anything in years, and she listened and watched his face change as he spoke, the tight quality of it softening, the careful distance he maintained with his expression becoming something more open, the gray eyes becoming something warmer than she had seen them. She thought, sitting across from Graham Dalton in the firelight of his mountain cabin, with snow pressing at the windows and Thomas's documents in the oilskin packet beside her, that she was in danger of a completely different kind from the one that had sent her up this mountain. A danger that was not unwelcome, which was almost the most frightening part. She went asleep in the cabin's second room, he had insisted, had made the bed and brought an extra blanket and said simply, "You will sleep better," with the tone of a man who was done negotiating. And she lay in the dark listening to the snow settle on the roof and thought about boot prints and trails, and the way one set of footprints can lead, without your meaning them to, somewhere worth being. On the third morning the snow had stopped and the world was white and clean and painfully bright, and Graham stood at the cabin door with his coffee and looked at the ridge and said, "Tomorrow. The trail will be passable by mid-morning tomorrow if the temperature stays up." Maria came to stand beside him. Her ankle was significantly improved. She had slept with it elevated as she had directed herself to do, and the swelling was down enough that she could put careful weight on it. And she stood at the door with her own coffee and looked at the same ridge and felt two contradictory things with equal intensity. The urgency to go, to get to Ridgefield and send the wire and complete what Thomas had started, and a reluctance she did not quite know what to do with. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask. The packet, the sworn statements. When we get to Ridgefield and I send the wire to the marshal's office, they will need your testimony. What Thomas told you when he came up here, what you understood about the situation, the fact that he chose you as the holder of this evidence. Your word will carry weight." She looked at him. "I know you came up this mountain to be private. I know this is not what you chose. I am not going to pretend the ask is small." He was quiet for a while. The light was coming off the snow in long horizontal bars through the trees, and she was acutely aware of his stillness, the particular quality it had that she now recognized as thought rather than evasion. "Thomas Whitaker knocked on my door," he said finally, and told me he was going to do the right thing even if it cost him. I told him I was not in the business of being trusted. He paused. That has been sitting badly with me since the day he left. He did not hold it against you, Maria said. He trusted you anyway. I know, Graham said. That is the part that has been sitting badly. He turned and looked at her directly. I will testify. I will come down off this mountain and stand in whatever room they put me in and say what I know, and after that I will come back up here. He said this last part with a certainty that she understood was not stubbornness, but was instead the carefully maintained boundary of a man who knew his own limits. After that you will come back up here, she agreed. She meant it as acknowledgement, not argument. She was not in the business of asking people to be other than what they were. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully classify, something that contained questions he had not yet decided to ask, and she met it steadily and let the moment hold itself. The fourth day on the mountain, the day before the descent, they spent in a different kind of activity. Graham showed her the property. Not out of any obligation, but because she asked with a genuine curiosity that she thought he recognized as real rather than polite. And he led her out into the snow with a walking stick he had cut for her ankle and showed her the timber stands and the small spring that ran year-round and the meadow above where the elk came in early October. He showed her the garden plot at the east side of the cabin, and when she looked at him he said, "Clara planted it. I have kept the stones in place." He said this simply and without visible pain, and she understood that the 3 years had done what they were supposed to do, not erase anything, but make it into something carryable. She stopped at the edge of the garden plot and looked at the careful arrangement of the boundary stones, some of them etched with small marks that might have been decorative. She cared about this place, Maria said. She chose it, Graham said. She was the one who found the location. I wanted lower ground and she said higher. She said she wanted to see the whole sky. He looked up, and the sky above the mountain was that particular deep cobalt blue that high altitude produces in good weather, enormous and absolute. She was right, he said. Maria looked at him looking at the sky, and she thought that whatever had broken in this man 3 years ago had been something central and serious, and had been very imperfectly repaired. The way a bone sometimes sets crooked and still bears weight, but is not quite what it was. She thought that he was not finished grieving, not really, but that he was further along than he believed himself to be. And she thought, she allowed herself to think, that the careful way he had attended to her since the ravine, the water and the compress and the coffee and the paper and the steady, unhurried presence, was not merely the obligation of a man who had found a stranger in distress, but was something else, something that had been dormant in him and had woken up in spite of his best intentions. She thought about her own life in Kansas City, the room with the painted windows. She thought about what it might mean to find a place where the sky was something you could actually see. She did not say any of this. It was too soon, and she was not reckless, and there were still things that needed doing before she could afford to be anything other than focused. But she held it, the thought, the way you hold something delicate cupped in both hands, attentive, not squeezing. They came back inside and ate the last of the venison stew, and Graham announced that they would leave at first light, and Maria agreed, and they sat by the fire in the comfortable silence that had become, over 4 days, as natural to her as breathing. "Graham," she said. She used his given name for the first time, and she watched him register it, the slight change in his attention. "Yes." "What will you do?" she said carefully. "After." He looked at the fire for a moment. "After the testimony. After everything. After Price is dealt with. After the marshal's investigation. After." She let the words sit. "You have been up this mountain for 3 years. You are a man of considerable skill and ability. You have a friend buried in Ridgefield who will wonder why you are still here." She paused. "I am asking because I want to know, not for any other reason." He was quiet for a long time, longer than usual, and she let him be. "I have been asking myself that question since you showed up in my ravine," he said. "I have not arrived at an answer." "That is honest," she said. "You seem to prefer honesty." "I seem to," she agreed, and then, "I am going to be in this territory for some time. The legal proceedings will take months. I have a profession that is genuinely needed here. I had been considering Harlow, but I think after everything, a different location might be wiser." She paused. "Ridgefield is said to have a reasonable population and no medical practitioner." He turned and looked at her fully. The firelight was doing something specific to his face, filling in the harder angles, making the gray eyes look warmer than stone, and she looked back at him without looking away. "Ridgefield is 4 miles from the base of this trail," he said. "I am aware," she said. "That is a reasonable riding distance," he said. "In good weather." "It is," she agreed. He held her gaze for a moment that extended past the comfortable and into something else, something that had more weight to it, more possibility, more of the particular risk that comes with wanting something after a long time of not wanting anything. "I would not be opposed," he said finally, "to having a neighbor, a reasonable distance away." Maria Whitaker, who had been living on nothing but determination and black coffee for the better part of a month, felt something warm and specific move through her chest, and she let it. "Good," she said. They left at first light. The descent was slower than the ascent would have been with 2 fully mobile people, but Graham managed it with the same practicality he applied to everything. The mare loaded with their combined gear, Maria riding for the steeper sections, and walking for the manageable ones. Graham setting the pace and reading the trail with the expertise of a man who had been doing this for years. They reached the base of the mountain by early afternoon, Ridgefield's cluster of buildings coming into view below them as the trees thinned. Ridgefield was larger than she had expected, and better organized, a real main street, a general store, a hotel that looked functional rather than merely aspirational, and crucially, a telegraph office that was open and staffed by a young man who looked faintly surprised by their arrival, but recovered quickly. Maria composed the wire to the territorial marshal's office in Denver, while Graham watered the animals and got information from the hotel keeper about the current state of the main roads. Her wire was precise and detailed, and included a list of the specific documents she was holding along with a request for a responding officer to come to Ridgefield within the week. She used her full name and her connection to Dr. Oakes in Kansas City as a reference, and she added a postscript that Graham Dalton of the San Juan High Country would be providing supporting testimony. The response came within 2 hours. The Territorial Marshal's office confirmed receipt and advised that Deputy Marshal Horace Fenwick would be in Ridgefield within 3 days. 3 days. Graham had been standing at the edge of the telegraph office when she emerged with the response in her hand, and she showed it to him and he read it and nodded once. 3 days, he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "There is a hotel. 2 rooms are available according to the keeper." He looked at her with a slight expression that she was becoming fluent in, the one that meant he was adjusting to a situation that was moving faster than he had anticipated, but that he was not at its core opposed to. 2 rooms, he said. "I thought that was clear," she said innocently. For the first time since she had known him, Graham Dalton almost smiled. He paid for both rooms before she could stop him, which she registered as something significant and said nothing about. She spent the first afternoon at the hotel, writing the formal statement that would accompany the documents and organizing the materials into a coherent legal presentation. Graham spent it making arrangements to have the mare properly stabled and sending his own brief wire to the land office in Denver, which concerned a different matter, a property registration question that she gathered related to the cabin's official status, which he had apparently not gotten around to formalizing in 3 years. That evening they ate dinner at the hotel's dining room, which served actual food, beef and roasted potatoes and bread that was not hard, and they ate across a proper table with a lamp between them and the sounds of a functioning town coming through the window, and it was different from the mountain in every physical way and fundamentally the same in the way that mattered, which was the quality of the silence between the words. He told her about his life before the mountain. He had grown up in Missouri, had learned surveying from his father, had come west in his mid-20s as part of a territorial survey team that had taken him through Kansas and Colorado before he settled in the San Juans. He had met Clara at a dance in a town called Red Brick, which no longer existed, and they had married within 6 months, and he had built the cabin because she wanted to be somewhere she would not have to share the sky. He talked about her with the careful tenderness of a man who has made peace with loss without making peace with missing, and Maria listened and thought that Thomas had been right to trust him. This was a man whose word meant something, whose commitments, once made, held. She told him more about Kansas City. She told him about the patients she remembered, and the things she had learned from them, and the particular education of spending years watching people in the most vulnerable moments of their lives. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher, and who had believed with religious conviction in the value of a clear sentence and a well-organized argument, which she thought explained a great deal about her. "He would have liked you," she said, surprising herself. Graham looked up from his plate. "Why? You say what you mean," she said. He believed that was the most important thing a person could do. He said most of the trouble in the world came from people saying something other than what they meant. Graham considered this. "He was probably right," he said. "He was right about most things," she said. "I never told him that adequately when he was alive." That is the thing about people you love. You assume there will be more time to tell them the things that matter. Graham was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, and then, "I know exactly what you mean." They sat with that between them for a moment, the shared understanding of people who had both learned too young the truth about time and its pretended abundance. It was the second evening in Ridgefield, after the organizational work was done, and the documents were in order, and the wait for Deputy Marshal Fenwick was nothing but waiting, that Graham knocked on the door of her room. She had been expecting it in the way that you expect whether you can see building on the horizon, not with certainty, but with a readiness that has been growing for days. She opened the door. He was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him in an uncertain posture, the first crack in the self-contained surface, and it made him look younger and more like a person who needed things, and less like a person who had arranged his life specifically not to. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Come in," she said. She left the door open, which was proper, and sat in the room's single chair while he stood near the window with the hat still in his hands. "The things you said about Ridgefield," he began, "about the medical practice, about the 4 miles from the trail." "Yes," she said. "Were you saying them because they were true, or were you saying them because you thought I needed to hear something that would make sense of?" He paused, searching for the word, "of whatever this is." She looked at him carefully. "Both," she said honestly. "They are true, and I knew they would matter to you. I would not have said them if they were not also true." He absorbed this. "I have not," he started and stopped. He looked at the hat in his hands as if it contained some kind of instruction that it was failing to provide. "I have not allowed myself to want things in a long time," he said. "I had reasons that seemed good at the time." "They were good reasons," she said. "Loss is a reason. Grief is a reason. Protecting yourself from more of something that was unbearable is a perfectly good reason." "But," he said it as if he knew there was one coming. "But reasons that were right once are not always right forever," she said gently. "You are not the same man who came up that mountain 3 years ago. You are a man who has spent 3 years becoming someone capable of coming down it." He looked at her. The lamplight was low and golden, and the window showed the darkness outside and the distant shapes of the mountains, and she held his gaze because she understood that he needed her too. "I need more time," he said. "I know," she said. "I am going to be in Ridgefield for months. We have all the time that is available to us, which is precisely as much as we have and not 1 hour more, and I have learned to find that sufficient." Something in him settled. She could see it happen, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his breathing, the way the hat found its way to the window ledge and stopped being something he was holding on to. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I would expect nothing else," she said. "I have thought about you constantly since the ravine," he said. "Not in a way I fully chose, in a way that felt more like recognition, like meeting something I had forgotten was possible. Maria Whitaker sat very still and felt something open in her chest like a window in a room that had been shut too long. "Graham," she said. "Yes. I know exactly what you mean," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the room's other chair, turning it to face her, and they sat close in the lamp light and talked for a very long time about nothing important and everything important, and the mountain watched through the dark window without judgment. Deputy Marshal Horace Fenwick arrived on the third day, which was also the day that two of Wendell Price's men arrived in Ridgefield looking for Maria Whitaker. She did not know about the second development until after the first had been handled. Fenwick was a compact, sharp-eyed man of about 45 who read every document she gave him without speaking, asked 10 precisely targeted questions, read the documents a second time, and then said with the flat certainty of a man who had been doing this work for 20 years, "This is sufficient. We will have men in Harlow by the end of the week." He looked at Graham. "Your testimony, Mr. Dalton." He said it as a statement, and Graham said yes, with the same tone, and the business portion of the matter was, in its essentials, concluded in under 2 hours. It was the hotel keeper who found her after the meeting to tell her that 2 men had been in that morning asking after a woman traveling alone with a doctor's bag, brown hair, brown eyes, came up from the south. The hotel keeper, who had formed his own opinions about Graham Dalton in the past 3 days, and about the woman who had come down the mountain with him, had told them he had not seen anyone matching that description. Graham, when informed of this, went very quiet in a specific way that she was learning meant he was angry rather than merely thoughtful. "They will have people watching the road south," he said. "Then I will not take the road south," she said. "I will stay in Ridgefield until the marshal's men move on Harlow. Once Price is in custody, his interest in finding me disappears." "That is 3 to 5 days minimum," Graham said. "I have a medical practice to establish," she said. 3 to 5 days is not wasted time." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was becoming very familiar with, the one that was not quite surprised but lived in that neighborhood. "You are going to be all right," he said. It came out not as reassurance but as recognition, as if he were confirming something he had suspected for a while. "I have always been all right," she said. "Sometimes it requires more effort than other times." The marshal's men took Wendell Price into custody on a Thursday, which she learned via telegraph from Fenwick on the Saturday following. The charges were multiple: conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of Thomas Whitaker and at least 2 other individuals, fraudulent acquisition of mining claims through intimidation and falsification of survey documents, and the unlawful displacement of 2 independent claim holders. The sheriff, Burl Cassidy, was also taken into custody as an accessory after the fact. Maria received this news standing at the telegraph office with Graham beside her. She read the wire twice and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket beside the spot where Thomas's journal had lived for the past month, and she stood in the bright cold Ridgefield morning and let herself feel, for the first time, that it was over, that Thomas had not died for nothing, that the trail he had left for her had led somewhere. She was aware of Graham standing next to her, close enough that his shoulder was almost at hers. "It is done," he said. "Most of it," she said. "The legal proceedings will go on for months. I will need to testify. Fenwick will need follow-up documentation." She tucked the wire into her pocket. "But the main thing, yes, the main thing is done." He was quiet. Then he would have been glad. "Yes," she said. "He would have been absolutely insufferably glad, and he would have made me admit I could not have done it without help." She paused. "Which I could not have, so he would have been right." Graham turned and looked at her profile, the way she was standing with her face tilted slightly up against the cold air, eyes bright and set with something he recognized now as the particular expression she wore when she had resolved something difficult and was already looking at what came next. "Maria," he said. She turned to look at him. "Come to dinner," he said. "Tonight." She smiled, a full one, not the near miss she had offered before, but the real version, which transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere in the center of his chest and did not move. "Yes," she said. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Maria Whitaker's life since the last Christmas she had spent with Thomas, and she knew it while they were happening, which was a gift she had not expected. She set up her practice in Ridgefield in a pair of rooms above the general store, clean and well lit. And within a week she had treated 5 patients ranging from a minor's broken finger to a complicated childbirth that had been progressing dangerously before she arrived. The community took her in with the practical warmth of a place that has needed something for a long time and is relieved to have it. Graham came down from the mountain twice that first week and 3 times the second. He said he had supply runs to make, which was partly true. He helped her move furniture on the first visit, built her a proper examining table on the second, and on the third appeared without specific pretense and simply sat in her front room and read while she finished her evening records. And when she was done, they walked down the main street of Ridgefield in the early winter dark with their breath clouding in the lamplight, and talked about nothing in particular with the easy fluency of 2 people who have discovered they fit together, in a way neither had previously encountered. He told her, on the 4th visit, about the land office response to his wire. The cabin was now registered properly in his name, the property boundary confirmed. He said this as if it were a purely administrative matter. She understood it as something else, as the statement of a man beginning to think about permanence in the terms of the living rather than only the dead. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his palm up and held it. They had their first argument on the 5th visit, about something that was partly about medicine and partly about something else entirely. The question of whether solitude was a choice or a habit, and whether there was a meaningful difference. She said it was a habit masquerading as a choice in his case, and he said she was projecting her own fear of stillness onto him, and they both sat with that for a moment before simultaneously acknowledging that they were each somewhat correct. And then they laughed, which released something that had been building, and afterward the quality between them was different, more settled, more genuine, stripped of the last of the careful performance that people maintain in early acquaintance. "I am not afraid of stillness," she said more honestly later. "I am afraid of stillness that is actually stagnation. There is a difference." "There is," he said and smiled at her, a real one, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face so completely that she understood all at once what he must have looked like before the grief, the warmth that had been living under the careful distance all this time. "Graham," she said. "Yes. I think I am falling in love with you," she said. "I thought you should know." He looked at her with the gray eyes that were warm now as spring water in sunlight, and he said, "I know. Because I am entirely certain that I am falling in love with you, and I have been for longer than I have had the courage to admit it." She leaned across the table and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the same quality he applied to everything, fully, without reservation, as if he had made the decision and intended to hold to it. The winter passed in this way, Maria building her practice, Graham coming down the mountain, the 2 of them spending their time between Ridgefield and the cabin with an easy rhythm that felt less like 2 separate lives accommodating each other, and more like one life being discovered in the space between them. She went up the mountain for the first time in December, her ankle completely healed, on the good trail in clear weather, and Graham met her at the lower ridge with 2 horses and brought her the rest of the way up. She stood in front of the cabin in the winter light and looked at it, the stone chimney, the glass windows, the garden plot with its careful stones under the snow, and felt something she would not have been able to name in October but could name clearly now. She felt like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. They stood together at the cabin door and looked at the sky, which was the absolute cobalt blue of high-altitude winter, enormous and complete. "You can see the whole sky," she said. "Yes," he said. He was standing behind her close, his hands warm on her shoulders. "Clara was right. She was," Maria said, and then gently, "I think she would have liked me." He was quiet for a moment. "I think she would have liked you very much," he said. I think she would have been glad. Maria leaned back against him and he put his arms around her and they stood in the cold, bright December air and looked at the whole sky together. The legal proceedings unfolded through the winter and into the spring exactly, as Fenwick had predicted, long, methodical, and ultimately decisive. Maria testified twice in Denver, once in January and once in March, taking the stage each time and returning to find Graham's horse tied at the hitching post outside her practice, which she had stopped questioning and started expecting. Price's trial concluded in late April with a conviction on all principal charges. Burrell Cassidy pled to a lesser charge and was removed from the territory. The 6 fraudulently acquired mining claims were returned to their rightful holders, or, in the cases where the original holders were dead, to their estates. Thomas's claim was now Maria's by inheritance. The land office in Denver confirmed this in a letter she received on a Tuesday afternoon in May, sitting at her examining table between patients. She held the letter and thought about her brother and his coffee with too much sugar and the arguments they had never properly concluded, and she let herself cry for a few minutes, which was something she had not let herself do since the night she read his journal. Then she blew her nose on a clean piece of gauze which was undignified but practical and saw her next patient. Graham was at her door that evening. "I heard from the land office," she said when she opened it. "I know," he said. He had a particular expression, one she had not seen before, a combination of decision and nervousness that she found endearing in a way she did not tell him immediately. "I spoke to Fenwick. The claim is in good order." "Yes," she said. She stepped back to let him in and he came in and did not sit down, which was unusual. "Maria," he said. She waited. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the question of permanence." "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about it since December," he said. "Specifically since December, when you stood in front of the cabin, and I understood that you were the kind of person who understands what a place means. Not just what it is, but what it means." "Graham," she said, "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you are willing. I would like to make the cabin a real home, and I would like Ridgefield to be where you practice, and I would like the 4 miles between them to be something we travel together every day for the rest of whatever time we have." He paused. "I would also like to tell you that I love you, not in the falling sense but in the arrived sense. I arrived at it somewhere around the 2nd day on the mountain, and I have been here ever since." Maria Whitaker, who had grown up in Ohio and been trained in Kansas City, and had come west on a stage coach in the autumn of 1878 to find her dead brother's evidence, and had instead found this, looked at Graham Dalton in the warm May evening light of her Ridgefield rooms, and said yes with her whole self. They were married in June in Ridgefield's small church, which was a plain frame building with clear glass windows that showed the mountains on 3 sides. The minister was a young man who had been Maria's patient twice, and who performed the ceremony with a sincerity that she appreciated. The witnesses were Edna Pierce, who had made the journey from Harlow to be there, and Deputy Marshal Fenwick, who had driven down from Denver and brought a bottle of decent bourbon that he said was not official business, but that he had wanted to see through. Graham wore his best coat, which was not flashy but was well made and fit him properly, and he stood at the front of the plain church and watched Maria come down the aisle with the particular stillness she now recognized as his version of being overwhelmed. And she came to stand beside him and took his hand, and felt it hold hers with the same steadiness it had offered her in the ravine, fully, without reservation, as if he had made the decision and intended to keep it. They said their vows in the traditional form, and when they were concluded Graham looked at her with the gray eyes that had been cold as stone the first time she had seen them, and were now the warmest thing she had ever been looked at with, and he said, very quietly just for her, "I followed the second set." She understood him completely. "I know," she said. "I am glad you did." They moved the practice up 2 months after the wedding, not abandoning Ridgefield but expanding, Maria establishing a second arrangement with a younger woman in town, a Mrs. Helen Carver, who had sufficient training to manage the routine cases, and who would wire Maria in emergencies. The cabin was expanded in the fall, Graham cutting and fitting the additional room with the same precision he applied to everything. The new space designed with light in mind, large windows facing the mountains. Maria planted a garden east of the old one, next to Clara's stone border, and Graham helped her set the new stones, and they worked in the afternoon light without talking much because they did not need to. In the spring of the following year, 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas Richard Dalton, and he arrived in the late April thaw with considerable vocal energy and a head of dark hair that belonged entirely to his father and brown eyes that were his mother's unmistakably. Graham held him in the cabin with the windows open to the first warm air of the year and looked at his son's face with an expression Maria had never seen from him before and did not have a word for yet, something larger than happiness, something that had the quality of the whole sky. "He has your mouth," Graham said. "He has your nose," Maria said from the bed, where she was being appropriately practical about her own recovery. "Which is a fine nose. He will not complain." "No," Graham said. "I suspect he will have your opinions and my stubbornness, and we are both going to have a great deal of explaining to do." "Probably," she agreed. He brought the baby to her and she took him, and they sat together in the cabin with the spring coming through the open windows and the mountains steady outside, and the whole sky above them complete. 2 years on, a daughter arrived, dark-haired and bright-eyed like her brother, whom they named Alina, and she proved to have opinions that exceeded both her parents combined, which was exactly what Maria had expected, and exactly what Graham had feared in the specific pleasant way of a man who is not actually afraid. Thomas grew up knowing the mountain the way his father knew it, reading the ground, tracking by the compression of prints in mud, understanding the way weather moved through the high country before it announced itself. By the time he was old enough to walk the trail alone, he knew every blaze on every tree between the cabin and Ridgefield, knew the ravine where his mother had been found, knew the spot where her boot print was still, if you looked at the right angle in wet weather, faintly visible in the earth beside the Douglas fir root. His mother took him there once and showed him, and told him the story without sentiment but with precision, because that was how she told important things. He followed the second set, Thomas said, when she had finished. "Yes," Maria said. "Why?" Maria looked at the mountain above them and the trail ahead and the specific clear late afternoon light that turned the spruce needles bronze at this time of year. "Because the second set told a story that required attention," she said. "Because your father is not a man who walks past something that needs attention just because it is inconvenient." Thomas was quiet, thinking about this with the focused seriousness that was becoming characteristic of him. "And that was good," he said. "That was everything," Maria said. Graham was waiting for them at the cabin when they came back up the trail, a leaner on his shoulders and the evening meal already started, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air. He saw them coming through the trees and raised one hand in greeting, and Maria raised hers back, and the mountain held all of them in the particular steady way mountains do, without preference or condition, indifferent to human trouble and simultaneously home to it. She crossed the yard and he came to meet her halfway and took her hand in his, the way he had been taking it since the winter before their marriage, with that quality of complete intention, as if the act of holding her hand were the same kind of commitment as any other he had made, requiring his full presence to honor properly. "Good walk," he said. "Perfect," she said. Alina demanded to be brought down and ran to her mother, and Thomas arrived at a dead run, having given up on walking halfway through the meadow, and the yard of the mountain cabin was briefly full of noise and motion, and the particular delighted chaos of a family that has found the place it belongs in. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire was banked and the mountain was dark and enormous outside the windows, Graham and Maria sat together in the quiet the way they had been sitting together in quiet since the first days, fully, without qualification, with the ease of two people who have stopped performing and started simply being. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Graham said, "if you had stayed in Harlow?" "I think about it sometimes," she said. "I think about what Thomas would have done if I had not come, if the packet had stayed in your roof beam." "He trusted the trail to get you here," Graham said. "He trusted me to follow it," Maria said. "And he trusted you to be worth following it too." Graham was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said finally. "He was," Maria agreed. "He was right about most things. I never told him adequately when he was alive." "No," Graham said, "but we named our son after him. I think that might have counted for something." Maria leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together in the mountain quiet, in the home they had built together in the place where the whole sky was visible. And outside the window the stars were out in their January clarity, dry and cold, and utterly still, as bright as anything she had ever seen, as many as there were words for love in the language of people who have survived enough to learn what it actually means. She thought about boot prints in mud, about trails followed in faith, about the way a story that begins in the worst possible way can end somewhere you could not have imagined if you had tried. She thought about her brother's last act of belief in her, and the mountain man who had honored it before he even knew what it would cost him. She thought about the second set of prints in the frozen earth, telling a story of pain and persistence and the particular human stubbornness that keeps moving even when moving hurts, and about the man who had looked at those prints and chosen, against every arrangement he had made with himself, to follow where they led. She thought, This is what Thomas wanted for me. Not the evidence delivered, not the justice achieved, though those mattered too. This, the fire and the mountain and the man who did not walk past. This was what her brother had trusted the trail to bring her to. She closed her eyes. Graham's arm was steady around her. The mountain held them both, and the stars burned clean and absolute in the enormous sky above the place where the whole world was visible, and nothing was missing, and nothing was left undone, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.